All right, here's what we're going to be looking at in this section. It's a typology. It's across lots of languages, but we're going to limit ourselves to one particular property. And in particular, we're going to be looking here at anteriority contrasts for sibilants across languages, how they pattern with regard to the phonological distributions that we've looked at, and how we can deal with this in an optimality theoretic framework. So we're bringing together just about all the material that we've looked at in this class so far into an illustration of how we're going to approach phonology, right? So we're bringing together phonological distributions, feature theory, contextual and non-contextual constraints or filters, and OT grammars, and we're going to take a tour of how sibilants pattern with regard to anteriority contrasts in the general case, as well as in specific vowel contexts. So you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. In this section, we're going to take a quick look at four languages, really detailed look at three of them, and then just mention a fourth. And I'm going to ask you to try to figure out the phonological distribution of this plus or minus anterior feature for sibilant fricatives. Now remember, sibilant fricatives are these coronal fricatives that have extremely loud noise components. These like s and sh and ch and zh, those kinds of things would also count as sibilants. They're going to be. We're going to look at fricatives here. You could also talk about sibilant affricates, but we're going to mostly focus on fricatives. Why are they so loud? Well, part of the reason has to do with this critically narrow constriction that you're making with your tongue tip. For a s sound, for instance, you're going to be making a very narrow constriction with your tongue tip near your alveolar ridge, and air is going to flow at very high velocity through that very narrow opening, and then it's going to smack directly into your teeth, right? And that's going to create even more turbulent and noisier airflow. It's sometimes called a baffle, that you direct a jet of air into a baffle, which is some obstacle that's downstream from the constriction, and it just makes for lots of very noisy airflow. In English, we talked about two different kinds of sibilant fricatives: the anterior s sound, made roughly with a constriction at the alveolar ridge, and the non-anterior sh sound that's made with a constriction extending backwards from the alveolar ridge into some part of the palatal region. And the exact phonetics, the exact articulation of these sounds is going to be very somewhat different in different languages. I'm going to write them all using these English IPA symbols, IPA symbols for English sounds. In Japanese and Korean, which we'll look at shortly, in fact, this post-alveolar one is probably a little bit different. But we're going to ignore that and just treat it as the minus or plus anterior feature, regardless of the little fine details that might differ on a language-specific basis. It's the same kind of contrast involving whether the constriction is further forward in the coronal region or further back in the coronal region. So this anterior feature is going to encode that. Let's start with English. This is a pretty easy case. What kind of a distribution do these sounds have in English? Well, we already know that they contrast. That's why they're listed in the English consonant chart, right? And you can demonstrate this using phonological argumentation by showing minimal pairs for anteriority, where everything about the words in question is the same except for the anterior value of some sibilant fricative. Or you could also use near minimal pairs where there's some other difference between the words in question, but the immediately surrounding context are the same. These are all perfect minimal pairs. What are we seeing here? Well, the fact that seen means one thing in English and sheen means something else. That means that s and sh are minimally contrastive in English. They can be stored differently in the lexicon, and they have different meanings associated with them, and they're produced consistently with a set of consistent acoustic differences or articulatory differences. Therefore, this plus or minus anterior feature must be stored in English lexical entries. So this consonant would have the feature plus anterior, this one would have the feature minus anterior, and English preserves this contrast in the output allowing words like seen and sheen that mean different things to be pronounced differently. Similarly, before all other vowels, you get the same contrast. Su means something different from shoe. Sock means something different than shock. Sake means something different than shake, and so on and so forth. Right? Now, we're only going to consider in this section sibilant fricatives that occur before a vowel of some sort. And of course, there are other facts about these consonants when they appear in different positions. And in fact, there's some very interesting generalizations, but for this section, we're just going to focus on how this anteriority feature patterns when it's before different kinds of vowels. Okay, so that's the English pattern. How would you describe this in terms of our phonological distributions? Well, it's almost not even a distribution. This is the one we referred to as full contrast or free contrast. Just it's contrastive, at least with regard to the context we're looking at. It's contrastive in all of them. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. How about Japanese? Here is a representative set of words in Japanese that contains some sibilant fricatives or strident fricatives. For this class, we're going to pretty much use strident and sibilant in exactly the same way. In professional phonology, there can be differences about whether people intend this term strident to also include labiodental fricatives. We're going to leave that aside here and just use sibilant and strident interchangeably to refer to these extremely loud coronal fricatives. And the question is, well, what kinds of sibilant fricatives does Japanese have? Does it have plus anterior ones? Does it have minus anterior ones? And how might we characterize the distribution of this feature? So take a moment, check out these Japanese words, and see if you can come to a generalization. Okay, well, here's what I see here. We have the anterior strident fricative sa. That's in a bunch of words. We have the non-anterior strident fricative sha, and that appears in a bunch of words. And so we know this is not going to be just a straight up inventory restriction or anything like that. It might be full contrast, just like English, although it would be weird if I gave you two examples of that, given that we're trying to do a typology. And if you want to figure out what's going on here, well, I've already told you in some sense that the following vowel is important. But even if you didn't know that, if you want to figure out the distribution of two different segments that minimally differ, or the distribution of feature values, it's the exact same thing in these two cases, what you want to do is take each value of the feature, plus anterior, minus anterior, and just make a chart of where each one occurs with regard to the preceding context and the following one. Right? So for Japanese, I'm going to start, I guess, with the plus anterior fricative, and I'm going to make a column for the preceding context and one for the following context. And for this word, I'm going to say, well, this appears with a preceding O vowel and a following O vowel. It appears with a preceding A vowel and a following A vowel. It appears with a preceding word boundary and a following A vowel. A preceding word boundary following O vowel, word boundary A, O or word boundary, and a following U vowel, preceding E following O, so on and so forth. And in Japanese, we're going to find that this plus anterior fricative can be preceded by either a word boundary or a vowel. And then we can look at the minus anterior variant and say, oh, this one can be preceded by a word boundary also. So word boundary A vowel, word boundary O vowel, word boundary O vowel. And so already we're seeing some similarities in the distribution of these two sounds that suggest there must be some kind of a contrast. And in particular, if you chart out this word and this word, you're going to find that they have the exact same surrounding context. In other words, this is a near minimal pair. Sakin, shako is a near minimal pair for anteriority. So it looks like at least word initially before an A vowel, the feature anterior must be contrastive in Japanese. Oh, same thing here for the O vowel. Word boundary O, yet either feature value can appear here. So this is a near minimal pair. So it looks like before A, before O, either one of these is available. Any other near minimal pairs we can find here? We don't have a ton of medial esh sounds in here, but we can at least say before A and before O, this is contrastive. What about before the E vowel? Well, what do we find here? We listed a bunch of contexts for this plus anterior s fricative, but one of those contexts was not with a following high front unrounded vowel E. We don't see that anywhere in here. So it looks like we don't have any examples of a s before an E vowel, yet we have many examples of a sh before an E vowel. So here's sh with a following E, 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 yet no examples of s with a following E vowel. So this looks like maybe the one difference between the two of them is that either value for anterior can appear before most vowels. Right? It's generally in contrast, except before the high front unrounded vowel E, where we only find the minus anterior variant. So assuming that this is a representative sample of Japanese words and that this holds more generally in the grammar, which it does, I'll just give you that, give away the ending, how would you describe that distribution? Well, we already saw that in the general case it's contrastive, but in some specific context, namely anytime there's an E vowel following, it's predictable and non-contrastive. So predictably, if the next vowel is minus back, minus low, plus high, minus round, then the value of anterior in that preceding fricative is going to be minus. So there, the contrast neutralizes. We don't have any minimal or near minimal pairs for anteriority preceding an E vowel. Therefore, it's predictable in that context. The contrast is neutralized, and this is a positional neutralization pattern. So we can describe this by saying that strident fricatives are predictably non-anterior before a high front unrounded vowel, but the feature is contrastive elsewhere in the language because there's a whole set of A, O, and presumably other vowels before which fricative anteriority is contrastive. So that's pattern 2, positional neutralization before the high front unrounded vowel. How about Korean? And here I've simplified these transcriptions to some extent, but they're again meant to be roughly representative here. And so what's going on here? Well, if you can't immediately see what's happening, it's worth, again, making out a chart of where each one appears and then comparing the contexts to see what you can and can't predict. So take a moment and do that if you don't immediately see the answer here. All right, well, what do we find? The plus anterior one occurs. Oh, the minus anterior one occurs as well. The plus anterior one occurs before A, before U, before A, before A, before A and A, before U. So it looks like a wide variety of vowel contexts. What about the sh one? Well, sh before E, sh before E, sh before E, sh before E. All of the examples we have here of the minus anterior fricative are before that high front unrounded vowel E that we saw was also relevant in Japanese. What's the difference here? Well, first of all, sh never occurs in other contexts when it's not before E. And second of all, s also never occurs in this specific context before E. So this means that given any following vowel in Korean, I can phonologically predict what the anteriority value of a preceding fricative has to be, but it's going to be different before E than it is before other vowels or elsewhere. So what kind of a distribution is that? It's complementary distribution. These two sounds can never occur in the same context. Given any context, it's phonologically predictable which segment will occur there or which feature value. But in this specific context, before a high front unrounded vowel, the value of that anteriority feature must be minus. And elsewhere, when you're not before a high front unrounded vowel, it must be plus. So this is allophony in Korean. It's never contrastive, the anteriority feature, but it changes its value depending on the specific context that it's in. So far we've seen free contrast in English, positional neutralization in Japanese, and complementary distribution in Korean, or allophonic variation. There's a fourth possibility here. What about Spanish? And here, there again, somewhere there's going to be a variety of Spanish that differs a little bit, but for most varieties of at least peninsular Spanish and also most varieties of New World Spanish, what you're going to find when you look at different words in the language, do we have plus anterior fricatives like sa? We do. It's a very frequent sound in Spanish. Do we have minus anterior fricatives like sh? We do not. So most varieties of Spanish have no non-anterior sh-like fricative. There might be a couple exceptions in the Caribbean as well as some parts of Argentina, but for the vast majority of Spanish varieties, we have only anterior strident fricatives. There's yet another pattern in the Spanish Peninsula where there are a few varieties that I think are vanishing and are extremely sociolinguistically marked, where you don't have either sa or sha, but only have the dental fricative th. This is pretty rare in contemporary Spain, but apparently it exists. In any case, you could still say that those ones have a plus anterior fricative, but no minus anterior one. It's just that the phonetic value of the plus anterior fricative is a little bit different. Right? So in the general case, for most Spanish varieties, we find an inventory restriction, right, where you just can't have non-anterior fricatives like sh in these varieties, in these languages, but you can have a plus anterior fricative like sa. Possibly also relevant here, although we're not going to look in too much detail at this, is Maori. Anybody remember what the patterning of this anteriority feature was in Maori? Well, it's kind of a trick question because Maori doesn't have any strident fricatives at all, so of course there's no contrasts for anteriority. Right? And so that's in some sense a fifth relevant pattern. We're not going to deal with that in much detail in this case. We're going to mostly be looking at these four phonological distributions: free contrast, positional neutralization, complementary distribution, and languages like Spanish where there's just inventory restrictions, and they generally have a plus anterior but no minus anterior fricative. Can we describe these using a sensible set of constraints and rankings?